Whenever I saw Sailor Moon's Moonstick, I always thought about how much I wanted it. Out of all of Usagi's wands, or rods, whatever you want to call them, this was always my favorite one by far. There's something so graceful about the relatively simple design of the wand. As someone who loves to do it yourself, I decided I wanted this not only for my hopeful future Sailor Moon cosplay, but also my collection. The replicas are pretty pricey too, so I just thought it might be a little bit easier to just make one. So in this video I will talk about how I made my Moonstick in hopes that it can help anybody else in some way. Before getting into the video, I want to mention that this will be split into two parts as the video is pretty long. The second part should be up around the same time, and it should be linked at the end of this video. So let's begin with the materials. So listed on the screen, I'll have all the materials that I used, and I'll also write them out in the description below so that it's easier to view them or copy and paste them if you want to do that instead. So now that you have your supplies, let's move on to the assembly. Alright, so first I figured out how long the staff needed to be. I started by figuring out how much PVC pipe I would need to cut to get a similar length to Usagi's rod in the show. So how I went about this was I positioned my hand like Sailor Moon's in the image on the screen, and I measured it down to where the rod lays under her wrist, and I came out with about 5.5 inches, which is 14 centimeters, around 14 centimeters. So this may not be the most surefire way to get your measurements, but it worked out for me. So after getting my measurements and marking it, I went to the good old Dremel and cut out my 6 inches of PVC pipe. I did leave a slight amount on the top above the 5.5 inch mark, just to leave room for sanding it down so it would be smooth. I opted to sand it by hand rather than with the Dremel bit. So take your time to Dremel it carefully, because this will definitely help lessen the amount of sanding you will have to do. And I'm actually working on another version of the Moonstick as well. And that one is a bit longer. It's about 6 inches. So I won't get into that too much in this video though. After I had it as close to flat as possible, I checked this by standing it up and seeing if it touched evenly all around the circumference of the pipe with no tilting. You may not have it 100%, but try and get it as close as you can without going below the 5.5 inch mark too much. After this, I rinsed it off to get all the sanded particles off and just let it dry. Now for the next part, I highly recommend using the flattest of your two PVC pipe ends for the bottom of the rod, as the top will be mostly hidden, so it's not as big of a deal, although you'll still want to have that pretty flat too, but just use the flattest part for the bottom. Before doing any painting, I wanted to have all the pieces attached. So I attached the wood piece, which I got from the craft store in the wood bit section. I attached that to the bottom of my rod, and I used 60-second Loctite glue for this, and then sanded down the wood to make it less bulky. Have the flat side of the wood piece facing downwards when you glue. The PVC pipe should go over the side that isn't flat, the riveted side, because this will make it easier to glue, and it's important for gluing the second piece to the bottom of the wood. So, because at the bottom of the wood you'll have to put on that half spear part to get the shape that Sailor Moon's has. So it's easier to just do this on the flattest piece, and then with the riveted end it'll just fit better in. The PVC pipe will fit better into the riveted end. It's easier to center this way too. And for the part that goes under the wood piece, I used a resin piece that I had cast a while back in one of these paint palettes. And this can also be done with wooden half spheres. And you can sometimes find them where you find the other wood pieces in the craft store. I just couldn't find them, so I decided to use a resin piece. So alternatively, you can use a full sphere piece and Dremel it in half to get the half sphere. So there's really a bunch of ways you can make this part, which is really great. Now for the molds. I first sculpted the moon and the part directly under it. And for the top of the rod, I used clay, and I used Worbla for the moon since I got frustrated with the clay. But honestly, you could do the entire moon piece and even the rod's top with Worbla. I personally wanted to use resin where I could, since Worbla is pricey and I'm trying to conserve it. Plus I can reuse the Worbla that I made the moon into anyways. So just heat it up, and I used Worbla scraps to make my moon since I had a bunch of scraps laying around. So always save your Worbla scraps because you never know when you can use them again, and you can just heat it up and yeah, you can use your Worbla again. So always save your scraps. The top part I made with clay, and then the moon I made with Worbla. But I'm gonna make these pieces with resin. I simply made the parts with clay and Worbla so that I could make a mold out of this and pour the resin into that, so it would help me get the shape I needed. Hope this makes sense. So after this, I made the molds. I was out of mold builder, and well, it wasn't necessarily that I was out of mold builder, my mold builder just went bad. So I decided to use some of the silicone I had on hand from working on some of my aquariums. I feel this part would be better explained in a video solely to that. So I will link the videos I used to help me at this stage to make the molds with this kind of silicone. So I used silicone too for this. I got it at good old Walmart. And if you have silicone you can pour, that would be the best way to go. But as I am on a budget, I made do with what I had on hand and cut corners where I could. So I used this silicone. Like I said, I'll link a video down below on how to do a method similar to this, just in case you want to see better, since I feel like this was the first time I really ever tried this method, so I feel like somebody else could explain it a little better than me. So I'm gonna link down below a video that can properly help you with that. So once the molds were done, I mixed up my resin and poured it into the molds. Then you just let it sit until it cures. when I removed the cast from the molds, I had some inconsistencies I wanted to fix up, so I poured some more resin and touched up some trouble spots. I had a few spots that were a bit tacky as well, so I used my heat gun to help out with this issue. After this, it was on to sanding and smoothing the resin pieces. I cut out some stuff here since it would drag this video out a lot. Now I hope I got footage showing this, but the bows on the top of the rod didn't cast properly. So the very base of them did cast though, and because of this I went in with Warbler to make the bows, and the base that did properly cure helped me position it how I wanted. So basically I'm saying if your mold doesn't come out completely correct, just go ahead and find there's usually a way to fix it, so just go ahead and figure out what you want to do, and there should be a way to fix it. I hope that made sense. On to the moon. For this, if you wanted to use clay or Warbler, that would work as well. And if you do use clay or Warbler, then you can just skip the resin parts. However, if you used resin, you may have some extra resin around the edges of your piece. Just cut these away. Then you will want to sand the heck out of the moon to make it nice and smooth. For mine, I left craters in the moon because, well, it is a moon, so I didn't fuss too much over this just because I would have been at this for hours if I was trying to fix every little inconsistency. More on that later. But you can fix this with resin if you'd prefer. To put my two moon halves together, I used hot glue to start, and then, you could also make a mold where it would be one piece to the moon and you can just pour it all in one piece so that there's no seam or anything. But this would be done easier with the molds you pour silicone to make. At least I believe it would be easier that way. But the way I did it was gluing the two halves together from the mold. So if the hot glue dried too fast, I would use my heat gun to heat the glue between the halves up so I could place it how I wanted without panicking over how fast the hot glue was drying. So now when my pieces were together, there were some pretty decently sized gaps in between. I once again used the hot glue to fill these gaps, and after that I smoothed it down with the tip of the hot glue gun to make sure it blended with the resin a little better. And it isn't perfect, but it looks a lot better than it did before filling it in. So you could also use resin here as well, but I felt I had more control over the smaller areas using the glue gun instead. After all this is cold, I took my super glue and glued the seams to reinforce the hold on the moon's halves. So after this, you will want to sand down all the glue, all the hot glue and super glue to make sure everything is relatively smooth and blended. Pay attention to the grit of the sandpaper to help this process go smoothly. I'll provide a sandpaper grit guide in the description if I can find a good one for anyone who may need it.